Welcome to Stories of Brisco and Bradshaw. I would be Bradshaw. That would be your Chickashaw Dave, your Chickashaw Hall of Famer who can't figure out how to work his computer, Mr. Gerald.
Are we
Brisco.
on yet? Are we on yet, John?
Yes, we're on yet. You got to be.
Okay.
This is horrible. You mess up every intro. We have got a great guest today, Mr. Brisco. We've got Mr. Jamie Greer, and I'm going to get it all wrong. We got Canadians, Canadian destroyers, crybabies, killers, butchers, you name it. That's the wrong order, but that is the book, and all those names are in there, and the book is freaking awesome. It is Mr. Jamie Greer. Jamie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Tell us the correct order of the names.
It's killers, butchers, crybabies, and Canadian destroyers.
Perfect.
Well, I knew
and
most
I got to
of
bring
them,
something up, by the way.
Yes.
This is a pattern here. Mr. Brisco got a book from you, and I had to go online to get a book. So
Yeah.
this has happened like not only more than once, every single time.
You want to see my book, John? Here's my book.
Yeah.
Well, it has not arrived in the mail yet.
It's a big one, but it should be there soon.
All right, hold it up here so we can see it. Man, that's a nice cover.
It's a big one. It was drawn by a local.
That's what Kramer would call a table book, right?
It is a table book, yeah. It's definitely one of those ones because it's 600 pages, so it's
wow,
pretty expansive.
How long did it take you to write the book?
Almost 3 years.
Wow.
It was first year and a half was a lot of research. I read about 100 years worth of newspapers.
How'd you find, like, I've always been curious about what you guys have done, because some of you guys have just done some incredible stuff. We've had on some great historians that have done incredible things. Getting history from 100+ years ago, especially with professional wrestling, when so much of it is hype and so much of it is propaganda, trying to figure out what is the real history that is there when you know that so much of it is part of the work.
Yeah. It was fascinating because in Windsor's case, our first promotion started in 1929. So from 1929 until about the early 70s, all the sports department for our local paper treated pro wrestling as if it was on the level with, Major League Baseball, NFL, NHL, that kind of stuff. So every day after a card, they had a full write-up. It was almost like reading, like a WWE Raw review or something, where people tell you what happened in the night before. So I would get almost blow by blow what happened in every match, whether there was interference, whether there was an object used, whether the crowd went ballistic, whether some granny in the front smacked them with a brick. So I just literally read through all these for it was a good 50-60 years of reporting. And through that, I was able to piece together the rosters that they were using on a week-to-week basis. And they were having weekly events for up until the 60s, up until Big Time kind of took over the area. They were held weekly. So it was like reading episodes of Raw every week. And I got you started to get a real sense of what the storylines were, who they were pushing, who they weren't pushing, who was a guest. And there were moments that happened that you could really get a flavor of who the crowd was reacting to, and it was fascinating. And I missed the research because that was fascinating to uncover.
In 1929, were they running weekly?
Yeah, they were.
When he first started, were they running weekly?
Not when they first started. I'd say the first 4 or 5 months, it was probably once a month. And then they kind of got their foot in at the Windsor Arena, which is an old, still here, but it hasn't been used for almost about 15 years now. It's where our junior hockey team plays for the OHL, or where it was. But for the longest time, it was kind of our Madison Square Garden. It was where all the big concerts came through. The Detroit Red Wings actually played there their first season while the Olympia was being built. So it was an NHL size for the time arena. And once he got in there, he started going weekly every Thursday night. And it became a tradition for close to 30, 40 years.
Now was Windsor also a territory? Could you consider a territory like they run multiple shows, multiple cities, or was it just
not really? I mean, they did multiple towns around the Windsor, Essex area. They would do Leamington, maybe as far as Chatham, but they didn't really go outside of Windsor, Essex County. but for the most part, I would say they were probably considered a satellite of the Michigan territory. They right from the get-go, right from the 1930s, Windsor's had a pretty close symbiotic relationship with whoever the major promoter was there. When we first started, it was actually the first WWE that Windsor worked for. Weissmuller Wrestling Enterprises, that was run by Adam Weissmuller, who was in Detroit. And he was the cousin of Johnny Weissmuller, the Tarzan.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah. But this guy was the junior heavyweight champion wrestler from Chicago, and he ended up having to retire early in 1930 because he lost hearing vision, and his vision got so bad. So he became a promoter in Detroit, and his company, Weissmuller Wrestling Enterprise. So I guess he was the first WWE back in 1929, 1930.
Yeah. This is Johnny Weissmuller, the Tarzan guy?
Yeah, it was his cousin,
Wow.
Adam Weissmuller. Yeah, so he came from good stock. That whole family.
Was Johnny ever in the business? Did Johnny ever?
Not that I know about.
You know, you'd think Johnny would be the draw. I mean, big, good looking.
Yeah, big time, man. They're your brothers, you know.
Unfortunately, Adam Weissmuller died from a stomach problem in the mid to late 30s there. So he kind of fell by the wayside. And I think it was just as Johnny was taking off. So I'm sure he probably would have used his cousin if he'd lived a bit longer. But one of Adam Weissmuller, one of his workers or employees, he wasn't a wrestler, he worked in the office for him, was Harry Light, who would go on to be one of the co-founders of the NWA in 1948 there.
Wow.
So he kind of took over Weissmuller's territory, and he was the one that around mid-1940s, he decided to partner with Windsor, and he pretty much turned Windsor into its NXT or its AAA farm system. So he kind of used Windsor as his starting territory. So guys like the Sheik, Leaping Larry Shane, guys of that nature, they would start off in Windsor, and they would kind of work Windsor for 6 months to a year to kind of get their ring time in, because they'd be working every week. And then they'd slowly start working them into Detroit. And then once they got their legs, they were, okay, now we'll send you through the whole territory system. So it was really cool to see a lot of these guys get their start. And they had connections to Montreal as well through Jack Britton, who worked for Harry Light. So he was down here and ran the midgets out of Windsor and Detroit as well.
I know a lot of those old cards and movies, and there were a lot of talent, a lot of professional wrestlers in there as extras and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did they come from his cousin or what? You know?
I don't know. That's a good question. I know what was Mike Mazurski. I'm getting probably.
Yeah, I met Mike. Mike was one of the early guys I met.
Yeah, he was in a lot of movies.
Yeah.
He started the CAC, wasn't it? Was it him?
Yeah, he started CAC.
Yeah.
Well, tell us, Jamie. I mean, you're obviously a bright guy to be able to figure out how to do all that research for so long on your books here. What was your tipping point in have an interest in professional wrestling to want to tackle a project like this?
Well, I've been a fan of pro wrestling since I was a kid. My family emigrated to Canada when I was about 5 years old. We came over here in '76.
From where?
From Britain. My parents are Scottish, and I popped out in England. My dad's job was we're moving him all around the world. He's a draftsman, and my brother was born, and he kind of decided to stop the train in Canada. So I grew up here. And it was seeing Roddy Piper on TV when I was about 7 or 8 years old, and because my family's all Scottish, so seeing a fellow countryman on TV kind of made life a little easier, which is probably why I gravitated towards the heels at a young age, because Piper was my guy. And so I've just been a fan my whole life, and it was, as they started, the WWE Hall of Fame started off, and I started seeing names that I wasn't familiar with. I've got ADHD, so they only discovered it about 5-6 years ago, but in hindsight, I know now where a lot of my flights of fancy came from. But I just wanted to find out who all these names were that I didn't know about, like who was Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, who was, I wanted to find out more about Bruno Sammartino. And so going down all these wormholes, and rabbit holes, I started discovering, oh, there was wrestling before the 80s. Oh, there was wrestling before the 70s. Oh, there was wrestling before the 60s. And then just over the last 20 years, it's just really, I just keep trying to dig further and further back to see where it's all come from. And it's, you really appreciate a lot of the older guys a lot more when you kind of see before them, so you can see what they actually changed rather than looking backwards and saying, oh, well, so-and-so has done it better since. It's like, yeah, but you should have seen how big it was when they did it first. And I love discovering all these old names that have, a lot of them have been forgotten, and that's part of what I was hoping to do with this book, is bring back some of these names and point them out and say these guys had extensive careers.
How hard was the research for you when you, like, the first Hall of Fame was in the mid '90s? I guess it was. I was there. It was tremendous to be able to be there for. Mr. Brisco was there obviously as well. But how hard was it back then to find books on wrestling history?
It was tough.
Now you can just you got the internet. You got so many more things available to you.
It was tough. I mean, that's probably why it's taken me so long. I mean, I'm 52 now, and it took. I only started this when I was about 48, 49. But I mean, I slowly started getting into writing about wrestling about 10 years ago. Back then it was really tough. I'd be looking to try and find books at yard sales and flea markets and things like that were written. But of course, a lot of that stuff was written, you know, more in the protective sense, that they were written more from the storyline points of view. So I mean, it was tough to get what was true and what was fabricated and so forth. But then, you know, more and more books. I'm not sure you can see, I've got a bookshelf over there. It's probably got about 60 or 70 books, from old books from the 1800s up until, or reprints anyway, because most of them are out of print. But it got easier, obviously, once the internet came on and people doing shoot interviews and things of that nature. But even with shoot interviews, you know, sometimes, you know, it depends what mind they were in.
You think?
Yeah.
Me and Mr. Brisco joke so much about, we see these interviews sometimes that we can get history wrong too. Don't get me wrong. We have thousands of matches, thousands of towns. You get towns wrong and people wrong. You don't, whether you mean to or not, but we see some of these like, we were there. That didn't happen. It's just not even close to true.
Yeah, that's one thing you really have to learn to read the lines too, with a lot of the reading and watching shoot interviews. And sometimes I would have to watch 3 or 4 different interviews just to sort of triangulate, going back to what we were talking about before we started taping, triangulate what the truth is out of the 4 different versions of the story that was told. But I was very fortunate that I interviewed over 70 people for the book. Some of them I interviewed. I had one of the last interviews with Paul Butcher Vachon. Him and his brother Maurice both started in Windsor, Detroit. They were sent down here from Montreal to learn from Bert Ruby. And Bert Ruby was such an influential guy, and you know.
Yeah, that's a name that's often forgotten, but the old timer, that Bert Ruby, man, that's a name that lives forever.
Absolutely.
You want to tell us a little bit about Bert? I mean, so the people that don't know.
Bert was his real name was Bertland Rubenstein. He was a Hungarian immigrant that came over to Canada originally in the early 1930s. He immigrated to Canada from Hungary because the communists were starting to move in, and he wanted to get out. So he moved over here, and he had been a champion amateur wrestler in the Hungarian army, and he came over and he got booked to do a little sort of physique promo kind of thing at a gas station.
You said something being an amateur ref. That's probably the reason why the Vachon were kind of attracted to him too.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And so when he moved over to Canada, he was doing this little promotional thing at a gas station, showing off his muscles and you know, doing some exhibition stuff. And one of the Toronto promoters, I don't believe it was Tunny, because it would have been too early for Frank Tunny, but the problem may have been the one that Tunny was working for, Jack Corcoran, saw him and said, "Hey, do you want to come and be a pro wrestler?" And he said, "Yeah." So he came and did a few shows in Toronto, and then he got sent to work in the Detroit area, Detroit Windsor area. and he ended up staying in Detroit, and he was a top star. Him and Luke Klein were both top stars in Windsor and Detroit in the 30s and the 40s, and by the end of the 40s, Bert Ruby was the head trainer in that area for Harry Light. So he was the guy, and people were being sent from all over. Don Eagle actually had a 6-month stint here in Windsor before he made his official debut in the Montreal area.
Yeah, well, we want to get into Don Eagle because to me he's such a fascinating guy, and of course to deal with George's George, later on in his career. His father too, was his father from that area?
Well, the interesting thing was that the Eagle family lived in 2 areas. They lived at the Kananakwe Reservation near Montreal, there, the Mohawk Reservation there. But with their fluidity of the passport, Chief War Eagle, his dad, spent most of his time in Cincinnati or Cleveland, Ohio. So Don was constantly driving back and forth from Montreal to Ohio. And I think he was spending a lot of time with his dad, and he was a Golden Glove boxer initially, but then his dad, I think, kind of coerced him to get into wrestling, and so he did a little bit of training with him. But then he was sent up to Detroit to further his training with Bert Ruby, and he did a 6-month stint here in Windsor, wrestling almost every week. And after that 6 months, he was sent off to Montreal for his grand unveiling, and that's generally where the history books generally start off, is with his unveiling in his home territory in Montreal there. But one of the things in the book you'll see is that he actually started off 6 months prior in Windsor and had a pretty successful run here.
Jamie, would you say that Bert Ruby was one of the best trainers of his generation?
Absolutely. And I would almost put him up there in the realms of, Stu Hart and, these guys that have just an excessive talent pool. I mean, this guy trained the Sheik. He trained Leaping Larry Shane. He trained Killer Kowalski. He trained Abdullah the Butcher. He trained Gino Brito. He trained, and then, when you picture some of these guys and the guys they've trained that all came after him, that Bert Ruby's teachings are really, if you go down the pipe there, you've got Bert Ruby trained Killer Kowalski, and then Kowalski went and trained Triple H. You've got a pretty substantial thing that Bert Ruby's teachings are probably transcending through generations that he would never have fathomed possible.
Yeah, you're exactly right, because I started in the late '60s, and I, in Leroy McGurk's territory, there were always a lot of Canadian guys here. And Bert Ruby's name, that's the reason I became so familiar with Bert Ruby. Through I would mention Bulldog Don Kent and a couple other, the Vashon, and everybody had great things to say. So I kind of like to think, I had a little bit of that Bert Ruby influence in me, because all the early guys I was working with, a lot of them were trained by Bert.
Yeah, I mean, he could probably very well warrant his own book as well, because, like I said, he's vastly unknown to a lot of people unless you study some history of it.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you talk about great trainers. Obviously, everyone knows, Farmer Burns, the first great trainer. And then
absolutely,
of course, Gotch, later after Bert Ruby. But there's that void there where Bert Ruby was probably the preeminent trainer in the country.
He probably was. I mean, a lot of those guys were coming from all over. Gentleman Jim Haiti got his start here with Bert Ruby, and like I said, the Vachons, and then George Animal Steele was trained by Bert Ruby here as well. So I mean, he was training right up into the '60s.
Not sure I'd claim George.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, I say that because Jared and I are really good friends with George. George.
No, I can imagine. Yeah.
I was just saying, this is a total non sequitur. I was just watching a video the other day of George. What a great character! When he did the when he did the the hand up, it just I don't even know how you figure out how to do stuff like that. It's just what a great character George.
Yeah, he was definitely. I mean, as much as I say I was a mark for the heels back when I was a kid. It was tough not to cheer for George when the whole mine, when his whole feud with Macho Man there. It was pretty hard to not cheer for the adorable beast, the adorable furry man.
We had great football debates on European tours with George. Not debates, just discussions about football. We both love football, and of course he was a coach, and
absolutely,
it was fun. It was fun being around George.
Of course, he's an extremely bright guy. He was a school teacher, but he's an extremely bright guy. I mean, I mean, we ran across it. It's really getting off the subject here, but yeah, we will. How all the buses have the movies on them. So we come to that Burning, Mississippi, and me being from the South, and I'd worked Pearl, Mississippi, worked a lot of those things. George thought that was so interesting, about the Pearl River and all that stuff. American racial history that Jamie probably don't know too much about, but yeah, George was an extremely intelligent guy, and he talked about Bert Ruby a lot to me because we, both been amateur wrestlers, amateur wrestling coach there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that I'm glad we got on the subject of Bert Ruby because
Absolutely.
what a guy gets left behind.
Well, I try to give him his due in this book because he was a huge part of Windsor scene. Because, like I said, when Windsor was sort of working as the developmental territory, so to speak, for Detroit and for big time wrestling, Bert Ruby was a huge part of that because he was doing a lot of his training and scouting over here. And there was more than a few guys said that it was Bert Ruby that found them there was a downtown YMCA here that's right downtown area. It was 5 minutes from Detroit. That he was always in there, and that's where he found Kowalski working out, and he told Kowalski, "Hey, do you think you can beat me in a fight?" And Kowalski's like, "Of course I can, you midget." And Bert Ruby manhandled him pretty good and convinced him that maybe I should give this wrestling a try. Because
yeah. I'm glad you brought up Killer too. Killer Kowalski, because everybody figures Killer. I mean, Boston, but his roots were up in Canada and his beginnings there. Tell us a little bit about Kowalski's early times up in that area.
Well, he started off in 1948 with us here, and he must have been a quick learner because within 6 months he had his first NWA title match against Orville Brown in Detroit. So he
Orville Brown. Wow, that's another name.
Yeah, the first champ.
Yeah,
that's right.
So he started off as Eddie Tarzan Kowalski, and
wow.
He quickly lost it. Well, because it was his actual real first name, Edward Spolnick. So I don't know if that was just locally that he started off as Eddie, because it wasn't too long after where he took on the Wolodik and then Walter. But yeah, he kind of got coerced by Ruby into training with him. And
do you know if he was a bodybuilder before? Because he was what a physique a guy had in the early days.
He was, yeah, he was always working out, and that was where he got Ruby found him working out. He was always a very like a health nut, but he was training he was going to school to be an electrical engineer, sorry, and he was working at the Ford Motor Company in Detroit, and he finally used up all of his sick days in the early days of his wrestling career, and he was kind of told to make a decision what he's going to do, and he wisely took the right move. He decided, well, I guess I'll give this pro wrestling a shot because I made more money in the first 4 months wrestling than I did in the first 4 years at Ford. So he went off, and he had actually signed an exclusivity contract where Bert Ruby was kind of his manager and booking agent for the first year or so, and he found that the NWA really wanted to use him a lot more, but they were kind of holding him back and using him more, I wouldn't say as an enhancement guy, but more as a mid-card, maybe the occasional championship fight in Detroit, but he wasn't being used the way he thought, especially when guys in Montreal and stuff like that were pushing him to the top of the card pretty quickly. So he actually took a gamble on himself after a year and bought his contract out from Bert Ruby and said,
I always figured that Kowalski and Thez would have been a hell of an angle back in those guys. They were both similar in size. Walter had been a little bit bigger than Lewis when Lewis was in his prime, but they worked a lot alike. I always figured that's been a dream match to me.
Well, they definitely had a few matches. He actually left, and when he left Ruby's camp, he actually went and joined Lou Thesz's camp and got some supplementary training from Thez. So he had two pretty good teachers in Bert Ruby and Lou Thez, and he feuded with Thez a few times in St. Louis, but he had quite a run with them in Montreal back and forth. So they did get their shots in, but of course Kowalski's biggest feud was probably against Bruno. I mean, he had a 60-year feud with Bruno Sammartino, and man, some of the matches they had at Madison Square Garden in Boston were huge.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where people sell Bruno short. But man, you go back and you look at some of those matches he had with the true workers like Thez and Kowalski. They were, as they say now, star matches. You know.
Yeah. Well, you can't argue
He
with
sold out the Garden, what, 186 or 187 straight times, whatever it was. I mean, you don't do that if you're not a good worker.
Yeah.
You know, it's just
Yeah.
people love to go back and go, I'm not sure that was good work rate. 186 straight sellouts will tell you that people are pretty happy with his work rate.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Actually, one of the things that I have while I was researching it during those 3 years, I was also accumulating wrestling memorabilia for Windsor centric and for the area. And one of the things I got was a 1973 magazine highlighting the feud between Kowalski and Bruno, autographed.
Oh wow! What year?
That's cool.
The 1972 wrestling annual, but it's autographed by Bruno and Kowalski, so that's one of my my treasured ones.
Yeah, when you laid over, is that Gene Watson behind you there, Whipper Gene? Watson, that picture behind you?
No, that's actually that's Kowalski again.
That's Kowalski. Okay.
It's an old beer ad.
What a
wow!
physique.
Oh, look at Walter there, John. Look at he's a handsome guy too, man.
Look at how wide his shoulders are.
Yeah. Wow.
He was a freak. He was also one of the first major celebrities to go vegetarian too, or an announcer, or announce it at least. And people couldn't fathom how this savage brute with those muscles wasn't eating any meat, but he was a devout vegetarian.
You know what's amazing, Jamie, is that, you know, matchups, sometimes you think they're going to be good and they're not. You know, there's a history of this. You know, guys come from one territory to another and think, oh, it's going to be a super matchup. And they don't work.
Yeah.
It worked with Kowalski and Sammartino. I mean, you talk about the 16-year run. That's incredible. That's one of the greatest matchups of all time. You know, sometimes when you got great stars and you put them together, it doesn't really work. And sometimes you put it together and you go, oh my God, that is what the business is supposed to be like.
Well, I think it was one of those things where it was one of the few times where, you know, Bruno was in a match where he wasn't the Goliath. You know, he was
he had to enjoy that.
And so it was an adversary that was believably someone that could tear apart Bruno limb from limb if he was given the right moments. And I mean, they had a lot of matches that, I mean, Kowalski won a lot of the matches by DQ just because he would end up pushing Bruno to the point where Bruno would use dirty tactics back, and he'd be the one getting caught, or there'd be double countouts or what have you. So Kowalski always continuously right up to the 70s always looked like he still had a chance to beat Bruno, which not a lot of guys got.
When you were looking at through the old newspaper clippings, you know, starting say in 29 through the 30s and all that, and you're reading the rundown of what happened at the matches, could you tell by reading it how good the different bookers were, about different bookers, their techniques, their trends, how they were booking and things like that?
Actually, the interesting
question
thing is that Frank Tunny twice tried to absorb Windsor into his Maple Leaf Wrestling territory, and he failed both times. And I'm almost convinced it was because of his booking tactics. The promoters, Windsor and Detroit, are very, very proud of people who are from Windsor and Detroit. And the promoters before and after Tunny knew that, so they probably had, I would say, 60% of their roster at any one time were local guys, were guys from Windsor, were guys from Detroit, or at best they were from Ohio, which was, you know, Ohio and Michigan shared a lot of the same territorial guys. So they got very, very loyal to the local guys. And when Tunny came in both times, he only lasted about 3 or 4 months in both runs and trying to take over Windsor. The problem was that he brought all of his Toronto stars, and he jettisoned all the local guys. So even the Detroit guys, he would get rid of the Sheik, he'd get rid of whoever. This was in the 40s when both times he tried. So both times I think he failed because he didn't realize the loyalty that this area had to its local stars. And he brought in Billy Watson, but you know, they might have come to see him the first time, but the second time they're like, nah, I've seen him once. The rest of the guys I don't care about. So his shows would start off with a 3,000 or 4,000 gate, and then by the third month he was down to 1,000 or dropping below 1,000. So it just became that once the spectacle of seeing Whipper Billy Watson faded, they were like, where's our local guys? You know, where's Kowalski? Where's this guy?
Would you say it was similar to the mistake that Vince made in Georgia Championship Wrestling?
Actually, that's probably a very good comparison. I think he drastically underestimated the audience and thought they would just be happy with anything and happy that Toronto was coming in, and they weren't fooled by it. And both times he kind of headed back and never really came back to Windsor again after that.
How did Windsor interact with the three big cities around it? And I say around it, Montreal is a little bit further off, but say Montreal to one side, which was a hot territory, which really created stars. Toronto, which was a hot territory, but in my opinion, didn't really create a lot of stars. You know,
they didn't.
And then Detroit also. How was the interaction with those three and the relationship?
Well, yeah, John, if I could throw something in there too, Jamie, and the Hamilton. I mean, Toronto wasn't creating a lot of guys, but Hamilton was creating a lot of guys.
Hamilton was, yeah. Hamilton was called the factory for a while there because they were putting out so many guys. The Tallest brothers and Dewey Robertson and.
Did they come down to Windsor?
Yeah, a lot of the Hamilton guys did. Yeah,
and Silent Brian,
the Scott brothers.
Silent Brian, that's right.
Silent Brian, we got to bring up Silent Brian. Where's my picture here? I'm gonna show you a picture. Way right there, Jerry. Y'all keep talking.
Okay, yeah. So the Scott brothers, George and Sandy, they were Hamilton boys.
Yeah,
also.
Yeah.
So were they used? Were they used a lot in Windsor?
Oh, in the early days they were. Once Frank Tunny kind of locked up that area as part of the Toronto territory, they pretty much stayed to Frank's territories. It's funny, Windsor worked a lot closer with Montreal than they ever did Toronto.
And that
was because Jack Britton, who was working for Harry Light, was from Montreal. So he was the pipeline that we would get Johnny Russo before we'd get Whipper Billy Watson. We were getting, a lot of those guys coming through. So that was a huge thing. And then in the early 70s, we would get guys from Grand Prix Wrestling because the Vachons would know about this area. So we would kind of get stuff from that. So we ended up getting a pretty good relationship with, and then of course, guys like Killer Kowalski and one of Windsor's other big exports, Abdullah the Butcher, both had huge runs in Montreal. I mean, they were world champions there several times.
The Whipper Billy Watson. Watson had my favorite move there for a long time. The whipper, and I tried it on a lot of guys, and it's hard to do because guys, their feet get tangled up all the time. But Billy, man, he perfected that thing where it was like super smooth every time he did. John, have you ever seen the actual whipper move there?
No.
Off of a headlock, you spell them off, you hold the arm, you spell them off, and you got a karaoke around, hit the ropes, and then you do like a backflip there. And I mean, it's a cool move. Pull it up one time. Whipper Billy Watson's
I will.
Whip.
Hey, but let me show you this. Greg Oliver, from Toronto, I'm sure you know. I was telling him about Silent Brian, who I like Silent Brian, by the way, so don't take this the wrong way. I was in Japan with Silent Brian, and they call him Silent Brian. He's a deaf wrestler, for those that don't know. He also goes by Silent Macney, which he signed this autograph that I'm going to show you here in just a minute. We went to Korea together. He was a friend of Tiger Jeet Singh, and so he was brought over that period. So I was telling Greg Oliver, I had my rope with me one day, and I was bored. So what do you do when you have a rope and you're bored? You rope somebody. So I roped Silent Brian in a parking lot,
nice.
and tied him, tied him up like a calf. Okay, so that's what you do. That's what you do. That's what you do when you have a rope.
If you're a Texan, that's what you do if you're a Texan.
Right. So we were just horseplay, one day in Japan and Korea. And so I told Greg Oliver, I said, ask Brian if he remembers that. So this is the autograph photo that he sent back to me to say that he does remember it. And let's see. Let me point him out. Silent Brian is this one right here.
Yeah.
Now, why was he silent? I never knew him.
Because he's deaf.
Okay, well, don't get mad, Bruce.
Well, I'm not mad. I'm just telling you, he always went by Silent Brian because he's deaf.
Yeah.
Like Celeste Rodriguez or whatever his name was.
I guess, yes. I don't know. It was his own nickname. He didn't like, that's not a derogatory nickname.
Yeah. That's what
he
he was
used that
known as.
himself. So I want to clarify that. But
Well,
now,
yeah, 'cause you'll
now
get
it's
in
one of my
trouble,
most
Bill,
prized possessions was that Silent Brian sent me this after 30 something years. He sent me this and it's hanging up on a wall.
That's amazing.
Did he call you and tell you he was going to send it to you?
No, he sent it to me through Greg Oliver. No, Greg
Okay.
showed up at the Cauliflower Alley Club in Vegas and he goes, "Hey, I've got something from Silent Brian." I go, "You're kidding me. I love this. I haven't heard from him in 30 years." And he showed me that what he signed it there.
That's amazing. Greg's a great guy. Greg was actually one of the many historians who helped me with the book. He was a wealth of information and just an amazing helping hand in this.
He has that.
Yeah, he is a good guy and a good historian too. He doesn't take good ribbing about the Canadian hockey.
No.
We sent him a few messages on a chain and he wouldn't even answer us.
He didn't respond to us. I can't help if Tampa, is now the predominant hockey club and NHL. He gets upset about that. You Canadian, I wouldn't classify you as a true Canadian, but you're a Canadian. Jericho used to get so mad at me and threaten me all the time. But he lost money to me. Greg has never lost any money to me. Jericho actually lost money to me. He bet on those Canadian teams to beat us Southern boys. You give us Southern boys a stick and throw something down, say hit it with it. I mean, you can't beat a Southern boy with a stick in their hand.
Yeah.
Well, Florida is pretty much the home of hockey, isn't that right, Mr. Brisco?
Yeah, we're Champa Bay now. Champa Bay, as they call us.
It has been lately, that's for sure.
Yeah. Okay, let's move back to what we're here for. Crybaby. Crybaby Canada's another guy that kind of gets lost in the shuffle there. But what an over guy he was, and tell us a little bit about how that character developed, if you can.
Well, he was originally from Montreal, George MacArthur, and he was a multi-sport athlete. He was a junior hockey goalie. And he was scouted, I believe he was signed to a developmental contract with Montreal Canadiens. But then he put on a bit too much weight one summer and he switched to football. And he was playing for the Saskatchewan Roughriders, I believe, in the CFL briefly, but his knees were too bad by that point. So he decided to go into sumo wrestling. And that led to him, he went from hockey to sumo wrestling in a span of 3 or 4 belt sizes, I guess.
Wait, where did he go? Where did he go to sumo wrestling with? Where?
That's a good question. This is one of those things that it's been one of those stories that I haven't fully deciphered how true this part is yet. But he definitely got his pro wrestling training in Montreal, though. He claims to have started in Japan, but I haven't actually found any conclusive proof of that. He was definitely over in Japan during the 50s, but that was much later after he started. So that might have been a part of his legend that he created to mythify his beginnings a little. But he came down to the Detroit area again to work and train because of Jack Britton, and he just kind of fell in love with this area, and so he moved to Windsor. And so he was a wrestler, and then he had the ability to cry on command, and he was a heel. And whenever time he'd lost, he would throw a crying tantrum, and soon everyone was chanting "Crybaby, Crybaby," and he became known as Crybaby Cannon. And he did that for several years, and then he went out to the West Coast for a while, and he was the Beat the Champ champion out there, and he kind of changed his gimmick a bit and became Man Mountain Cannon because he grew the beard and was a bit more the big guy, and he did the whole gimmick of I can take any punch to the stomach, and he had a feud with Bobo Brazil out there in Los Angeles because Bobo used his head, and according to Crybaby, cheated because he used his head, but he still managed to take him out. And then he came back to this area, and that's when he became the manager there, and he became the manager of champions for the Kangaroos, and then Kurt Von Hess and Karl Von Schatz and the Mongols, and he must have had about five or six, well, maybe 7 world championship title reigns with his various teams. And and then in the mid-70s, he started his own promotion, George Cannon Superstars of Wrestling. And that show was broadcast nationally across Canada and various parts of the US, parts of Britain and stuff like that. It was a pretty groundbreaking show. It combined some studio wrestling with some arena wrestling, and then the backstage vignettes that a lot of other shows would start picking up on. So another vastly underrated guy, not just from in front of the camera as a manager, but behind the scenes for what he did with his television show.
One thing
you mentioned television, and that's probably the most important aspect for a territory. Did Windsor have their own TV shows, and how did that develop?
It was broadcast.
Piggyback off of Detroit and Toronto.
Well, once the Sheik stopped taping his shows in Windsor, we lost that for a few years. And for the first half of the 70s, we didn't have our own promoter per se, but the Wildman Dave McKigney, the Bear Man, he would run Windsor, about 3 or 4 times a year, if not more. So we had him, and he brought in a lot of WWA guys, and then he kind of teamed up with the Sheik a bit more after that. But once George Cannon started doing his Superstars of Wrestling, it was based out of Windsor. Unfortunately, he didn't do his taping in Windsor until the early 80s. He was taping it in Toronto, and then he would tape it out of Montreal, and then he did a lot of his road tapings in the Maritimes in New Brunswick and Newfoundland. So even though it was based out of Windsor, it didn't really feel like a Windsor promotion, just because the shows were taped various places elsewhere. But I mean, those that were in the know were probably pretty proud of it, that it was a Windsor production, so to speak.
One thing I noticed in your book, which I've always been impressed with Canadian wrestling, was the diversity. Toronto was a very diverse talent pool as far, obviously you had all kinds of different, ethnicities within the city of Toronto. So there was kind of a reason for that, but you didn't have the segregation like you had in the South. Jack Nelson was a huge star more up in Canada than the South, because in the South, a lot of places he would not have been allowed to wrestle. You had your stereotypical heels, probably the best. The one I'm most impressed. I love Yusuf Ismail. That's one guy I want to meet. That's just the terrible Turk. One of the first great heels. But Jack Nelson came along and was a great star, and it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to me that in Canada it really didn't matter your race or anything else, different from what it was shamefully in the South wrestling.
Well, I think that's why a lot of African American wrestlers and so forth. I mean, first of all, a lot of them came up with the Great Migration to come work for Ford. I mean, there was a huge migration of immigrants from all over both Canada and the U.S. to this area for that, which I think is what created that diversity. But you're right. I mean, Jack Nelson was in main events within the first 6 months. So, I mean, and he was facing white wrestlers, which just wasn't happening at all until the 50s or 60s in various parts of the U.S. But there wasn't that segregation. We had the original Black Panther, Jim Mitchell, was also a big star here. Probably the #1 villain for the first 20 years that we had a wrestling company was a guy named Rough Rufus Jones, no relation to Rufus T. Jones. But Rufus Jones invented the Cocoa Butt, which unfortunately, as cool as that move was, it kind of became a move that was only passed down to other African American wrestlers. I think it kind of got lost in the translation and suddenly became the move of a savage rather than just a fighting move. But a lot of these guys, I mean, and then of course down the line, ultimately Bobo Brazil, of course, is from this area as well, not from.
I was going to ask you about Bobo. How big of a star was he?
He was huge. He actually, I mean, obviously he gets a lot of credit as being one of the wrestlers that broke a lot. I mean, he was. But one of the things you'll see in the book is that there was a huge trail of guys that led to Bobo being able to finally shatter that glass ceiling. That there was a lot of guys that were pounding on window panes and kicking down doors for him before he finally got there. I mean, that's not to take anything away from Bobo, because he was probably the first one when TV finally broke to really make an impact nationally to kind of get through. But Bobo was huge. And in 1960, when Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle first started what became big time wrestling mean, it was more of an outlaw promotion at that time until the Sheik took it over in '64. But from '59 to '64, it was Barnett and Doyle that were running Detroit, and they took over Windsor as well. And they created the NWA Canadian Heavyweight Championship that was just for this area. And Bobo he won it the first night, and it was a tournament that had Gene Kaniski, it had Fritz von Erich, it had a lot of big names, Angelo Poffo. So I mean, it had a lot of the big names. I believe Wilbur Snyder was in it too. So there was a lot of these big names that were in this tournament, and Bobo Brazil was crowned the first champ. I mean, they only kept the title for about 8 months, but Bobo was undefeated in Windsor for that whole year, defending that title. And then I think Barnett and Doyle decided that they didn't want to keep they kind of switched the same way that Tunny did, that they didn't take as many of the local guys. They definitely cut out a lot of the Canadian guys. They kept some of the Detroit guys, but they ditched a lot of them. And that's Bert Ruby ended up starting his own Motor City Wrestling as a side thing, because for a lot of those guys, they got left behind. And that's where he started off with, Dick Garza, who became Mighty Igor. And he's the one that took George Steele first. And then, so yeah, Bobo was a huge part of this area. And he's still one of those guys. You talk to anyone over the age of 50 here, and they're going to mention Dick the Bruiser, they're going to mention the Sheik,
yeah,
and they're
that's
going to
right.
mention Bobo.
All the wrestling fans will. Anytime, it's funny because when you go to certain territories, they always have their fans. They have their people that they love, and those are the two that always mention Detroit. I cut you off a little bit talking about my most valuable piece was Silent Brian, but the relationship with Montreal and Toronto, and also was that a sharing relationship? Was there ever an adversarial relationship?
Yeah. So Montreal was actually, I was actually somewhat explaining a little bit, but I'll go a bit deeper. So Jack Britton was one of the guys who worked in the booking office for Harry Light in Detroit. And so we had Bert Ruby and Lou Klein as his two trainers, and then he had Jack Britton from Montreal. Jack Britton was the father of Gino Brito, the wrestler. Jack Britton also started the midget wrestling. So he had the large stable. He had Skylo Low and Little Beaver and all those guys. So Windsor, Detroit they actually stayed in the Windsor side in a building. I actually talked to a woman in this random local history group, and she lived across from the house where the midgets were all housed. And she said that she was a little, she's probably 70 now, but she was a little girl when they were staying there in the 50s and late 40s. And she said they were always out having a party on the front lawn during the beginning of the week because they weren't working. And she just remembers they were all the nicest people, but they were a little rowdy sometimes.
A little rowdy.
But Jack Britton decided to base them out of here just because the Windsor, Detroit area was so central to so many big territories. We're only 4 hours to Chicago, 4 hours to Toronto, 8 hours back to Montreal. Plus we had Detroit, and then they can go down into Indiana and so forth. So it was just a really good central location for them. So because of Jack Britton, he was close with the Rougeaus and a lot of the other Montreal families. Montreal was a much cleaner pipeline than Toronto, because Tunny didn't necessarily work with Detroit all that often, just because there was a bit of a rivalry there. And it wasn't until the Sheik ended up taking over Toronto's booking in late 60s to mid 70s there, that Detroit and Toronto really started working together. So before that, Detroit, Windsor to Montreal was probably the closest connection that we had, which is kind of odd that our closest Canadian connection was 10 hours away rather than Toronto. But that's just the way it was. I mean, Jack Britton helped getting people here, and that's why people like George Cannon came down. That's why the Vachons came down to train here. We got guys like Johnny Rougeau coming down when he was in his first and second year to learn some stuff. So, it worked out. And it definitely helps, and it helped Kowalski get his big run there, and Abdullah the Butcher also went up that way forward as well. So it worked out in a lot of ways for a lot of different people.
Some of the guys you mentioned, Abdullah the Butcher and obviously the Sheik, are very known as being really hardcore guys. Was Windsor and Detroit a hardcore place before those guys? Or did their style kind of accelerate that?
No, I would almost make an argument that the hardcore style probably, if it wasn't born, it was at least gestated pretty closely in Detroit, because it all, I would say, it almost started in the 1930s with Bull Curry, Wild Bull Curry. He was using chairs and drawn blood in the 1930s, and then in the 1940s, Ivan Kamakov from the Kamakov brothers was a singles guy in Detroit, and he was using a coat hanger. He would use the triangle part. He would pull it open and choke a guy, and if that didn't work, he would take the hook and gouge him. And this was in the 1940s. So there was always a mentality, and I don't know if it was just that everyone was just so, they were playing to such a working class audience of they were all factory workers, that they all worked for Ford. So you had a really tough crowd, so it made you want to fight tougher. But there were so many times that I would read these articles of these matches in the 30s and 40s, usually Bull Curry, and then also about 36, there was an East Indian wrestler, Nanjo Singh, who was equally as violent. And his character seems a lot like he might have been kind of like the Sheik, because he was more of an Indian prince, so to speak. And then he was fighting hardcore. And of course, Bull Curry had a lot of legendary matches with Danny McShane, and McShane was one of the first guys to blade. And then Bull Curry and McShane had the first brass knuckles matches. So these guys brought a lot of brutal intensity to Detroit, and it just seemed that everybody was a rough guy, was a tough guy, and there was a lot of blood, and the amount of riots that are written about.
When you were doing your research, did you find any articles about, skepticism towards the blood and towards the juice or anything? Was there any
it's funny
pushback from it?
I read there was a lot of letters to the editor complaining about it. I mean, it's kind of funny. Almost every complaint.
Did they do it on TV too? Was it on TV a lot?
I don't think it was on TV that much. I mean, it seemed like we got Chicago wrestling for the most part. Detroit didn't really get TV until later in the 50s. So Windsor and Detroit were getting the Chicago on the DuPont network. There was getting the Chicago TV, and they didn't show a whole lot of blood on that. But I think it's because a lot of the guys who were doing it weren't getting booked in Chicago, probably because they were such bloody guys. I mean, I don't remember seeing much of any Bull Curry being on Chicago TV, but he was from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He was tearing it up and having bloody battles with so many guys. And there were so many tough guys coming up through there. And you saw a lot of these brutes go on. I mean, Art Nelson is from the Windsor area. He was born in Hamtramck, but he lived in Windsor. And
another brilliant guy in my career. I mean, this guy, what a man. I always thought he was an American, and was he in the Marine Corps?
Again, tough to say. I've read different reports. He also claimed he was a circus strongman.
yeah, I've read that too. But yeah, he helped me out so many. I first met Art in Amarillo working for the Fox, and he was down working for the Fox. Then when I went to the Carolina, Jim Crockett really adored the guy. And he was one of the main characters there in Carolina.
And he lived in Georgia for most of his adult life. He was big in Atlanta, but I mean he was that kind of tough, barrel-chested guy that he was an early tag team partner of the Crusher before when he was still Reggie Lazowski, and you can almost see that Art Nelson's character became both the Crusher and Dick the Bruiser. And then it was like,
that's a good way to put it. I never looked at it, but you're exactly right.
I mean, he was working these guys early on, working with these guys early on, and almost mentored them. And then they both went on to become bigger caricatures of Art Nelson's character. And this barrel-headed, short-haired, tough guy that was just beating guys up. And another one of those unsung guys that you don't realize, but holy cow, he was such a tag team specialist and was such a great bully character. And he had he started off in Windsor in the 1940s, and he was still going till was it 1980s, early 1980s? He was still wrestling.
80s, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, that was a pretty good run.
Was it that Detroit was just a tough city? Was that why the wrestling just?
It just seems to be, because I mean, I mean, it's still goes to this day. I mean, you've got guys like Sabu and Rhino and all these. It just creates people who are a little more intense and have a little bit more extra fuel in their tank, so to speak. I guess no pun intended, knowing we're both the automotive capitals of North America. Yeah, there just seems to be a certain, and again, I don't know if it's just the working class audience that they've always been around, and that this area has been so volatile. I mean, there's been, with the race riots and stuff, there's always been tension in this area. I mean, not so much in the last 30 years, but definitely in the 60s and then the 40s, there was the Belle Isle race riots as well. That there's always been a certain tension of people out for blood for something. And if they can go and get their release by seeing, you know, whether it's Bull Curry or Ivan Komakov or the Sheik. I mean, they flocked to see the Sheik for 25 years, to see him in there, and he was tearing people apart, and Abdullah the Butcher and Killer Kowalski, and it just goes.
So stop right there, Jamie. Let's go to Abdullah the Butcher, probably one of the better known butchers from that area. Was he a Windsor guy? Was he a Detroit guy that become a Windsor guy, or what?
He was born and raised in Windsor. He was a karate teacher. He actually taught martial arts to the police force in the early 60s, and he was doing a little demonstration at the Windsor Arena, and the manager came up to him and said, "Hey, you ever thought about getting into wrestling?" And Abdullah was like, "Not a chance." And he goes, "Well, why don't you just go and speak to Jack Britton? He's the guy who's runs the shows over here. Why don't you go talk to him?" And so he says, "Well, I don't really want to, but I'll talk to him." And the first question he asked Jack Britton was, "How much do I make?" And Jack Britton told him what he get paid, and he realized it was a heck of a lot more than he was getting paid at any of his other jobs. So he said, "All right, sign me up." And then he was brought over to Michigan, where he was trained by Bert Ruby and Gino Brito, and he started off in wrestling in Motor City there, and he was actually known as Zealous Amara.
Did he? Okay, so he did start out with Abdullah the Butcher.
No, he started off as Zealous Amara. Very similar character, though. Wore a little bit more headgear and more like a prince kind of a guy again. But he wasn't getting booked all that often. I'm sure he probably thought the Sheik probably was like, "We don't need any more hardcore guys here while I'm here." So George Cannon actually helped him out and said, "You know what? You need a bit of a reboot." So about 67, he sent him to work in the Pacific Northwest there in Seattle and Vancouver. And he did one show there and caused a riot in Seattle. And when he flew over to his first booking in Vancouver, the promoter at the time there, Rod Fenton, said, "I heard you were a bit of a butcher out there. I think we should change your name." And they decided to call him Abdullah the Butcher, and the rest is history. So they changed his name on the West Coast there. And after a year of work in Vancouver and Seattle, he got sent to work with Stu Hart, and Stampede made him into a superstar, and he became a main event.
So you think Stampede was where he first really became that
Stampede of Montreal,
internationally known superstar?
Stampede of Montreal seems to be where he got his first main event pushes, and he was a world champion in Montreal, and he was the Stampede North American champion like 3 or 4 times in only a 2 or 3 year span. So he was pushed pretty heavily, and he was fighting the Stomper, and he was, I believe, he even had a title match against Dory Funk early in the 70s there. So he was pushed pretty heavily, and then from there he was brought down to work Texas and Georgia and other places down there, and he
worked with my brother when my brother was champion too, so he got a few title matches.
Yeah. He was a monster heel because he was just so unpredictable. And
yep. We had Abdullah on the show. It was an incredible show to have him on. It was just, he's very articulate about what he did.
Absolutely.
It was very thoughtful, which is something you kind of expect it. Guys who play crazy people like that usually are smart people. Because you have to be smart to play that crazy of a character. And he literally saw that character and he thought, I'm gonna be different from everybody else. So he consciously developed that character. And then Stan Hansen says that he saw Abdullah, and that's where he got his kinetic motion, his constant motion. He saw Abdullah and Tiger Jeet Singh come out in the ring in Japan, And Stan Hansen says, that's where I got the idea. I'm never going to stop. You know, which is almost impossible. You know, Stan had a style that it's not replicated because nobody can do it. You know, but literally those two guys consciously developed their character. And Abdullah, it was so interesting to hear him say it himself that he literally thought about that character and developed it all himself. All that craziness and everything was very thought out.
Yeah. Well, he was a smart guy. He didn't go through a lot of schooling. I mean, he was pulled out of school in the second grade, I believe, second or third grade.
Right.
Came from a large family, very poor, but he was a hustler from the get-go. One of the stories was that he was, you know, 6 or 7 years old selling newspapers on the corner, and he would stand there and just cry until somebody stopped, and he would say, "Oh, I've got to sell these newspapers, or my dad's going to beat me." And people would buy the magazines, and then he would go home. And he would go home because it was easier than going from door to door. He'd stand in the street corner and hustle them all.
Stand in the street corner and cry, and people buy his newspaper. That's fantastic.
Until he said that stunt had to stop because one day he got caught because some guy went up to his dad and told his dad that he was ashamed of him for putting his son through that. And he's like, "What are you talking about? He wanted to do the paper route." And he said, "Well, he's out there standing on the street corner crying." And his dad took him home and actually did give him a firm talking to, shall we say. But he was the jobs he quit when he was teaching the karate was he also had his own vintage clothing store long before vintage clothing stores were cool. He would go around and take donations for the poor, and then he would go and then he would sell them to the poor.
I'd sell them.
He wouldn't say he was taking them for donations. It would take them. He say them, you know, for my family and so forth and so forth. But then he would go and he would. I mean, he donated a lot to the poor, but he would sell them to people who had money, and then he would take the money he'd make. He was always a very big philanthropist even back then. And then he would take that money and he would help out the poor families in his neighborhood. So he's always been that guy, and he did that for years in Georgia with his restaurant. So he's always had that philanthropic side of helping the poor, just because I think he came from such a downtrodden situation at home.
And it's actually very disarming, you know, hearing him, because you see his character and automatically you associate something with that character other than what you get when you see him. But it's obvious, but it's this very thoughtful, conscious speaker, you know, is very good with his words, and he's
absolutely
very soft-spoken.
And he's very, it's amazing how many people, when I was writing this book, I mean, it's almost universally known here in Windsor that Killer Kowalski is from here. But it was amazing how many people were surprised to find out that Abdullah was from here, just because for so many years he kept up. He was the madman from Sudan, so everyone just assumed he was a foreign villain. But no, he's Larry Shreve from right here in Windsor, Ontario, and he's very proud of that, which is awesome.
Another guy that rings a bell with me because he was one of the guys that I used to, when I was a kid, we all went to the drugstore to look at the magazines. You'd see on the cover of magazines all would be busted up and bloody, and that's our friend Brute Bernard, who became a very close dear friend of mine. And tell us a little bit about Brute's early days.
Brute, he's another guy that started off in Windsor, or in Detroit. He started off as the was it the Golden Terror? He started off as a masked villain, and it happened with a lot of guys. George Cannon started off as a rather non-creative name of just Mr. X, but those two started as a tag team together when they first started off together here in Detroit and Windsor. And then unfortunately George got injured and was on the shelf for about 6 months, so they unmasked Bernard a little earlier than they probably planned on it. And he was originally just Big Jim Bernard until he got his more famous Brute nickname. But again, another tough guy starting out in this area. This area just bred tough guys. It almost seemed like those are the kind of guys that Bert Ruby wanted to train. I mean, he didn't have too many high flyers or too many.
I know he did.
He went for the big guys. He wanted the brutes. He wanted the bruisers. He wanted the giants that he could shape and mold. Which was funny because he was probably about 5'6", 5'5", if that. Ruby wasn't a big guy, but he loved to train the big beasts and the brutes and the guys who love to draw blood. But he wanted them. He made sure that they could all wrestle first. That's for sure.
Well, like I said,
Did Brute partner ever make it up there? Skull Murphy, he was another brutal big guy.
Skull Murphy wasn't down here, no, because I believe Bernard's from Montreal, was he not? He's from that area, I believe.
Yeah, I believe that.
And so he came down through the Jack Britton exchange that we were talking about. Another one of the guys that came down to this area, and yeah, he had a good run here. Big Jim Bernard for probably 3 or 4 years, and then he finally got the promotion back up to Montreal, and then from Montreal went down to New York and Boston and everywhere else where he got hooked up with Skull Murphy and those two.
Yeah, and wow, what Murphy and Bernard. But funny story that I have, I've probably told it a million times, but probably told it a few times. Like I said, he was one of the guys I'd see on the magazines all the time. I was terrified of him, and I'm working Australia. I'm working Australia, and I'm young in the business, less than a year in the business, and so Skull was coming in. He was going to coming in from Japan, coming in from the U.S., go to work there for 2 weeks, and then go to Japan. So I see I'm working with him in some town, and they're telling me, and I'd made the mistake of telling Mark Lewin and Keith Curtis my kid story that I was terrified of Brute Bernard. I think that's the reason they went to Barnett, and I think that's the reason I got booked with it, because I was terrified of Brute. I'd never seen Brute in my life in person, just on the magazine covers, busted open with blood down him. So I'm working with him. I go to the ring first, of course, babyface. All of a sudden, here comes Brute, and the entire outside arena is scattered. He's doing his best, man. He's doing all that stuff, knocking chairs over, scaring people, chasing people around. And the first thing he does, I was terrified he was going to bust me open, because they said, don't let him hit you with anything. He'll bust you open. First thing he does, he goes to the ring apron, pulls that up, and comes out with one of those damn pipe races they used to do the turnbuckles with, tighten the turnbuckles. Yeah. And I'm thinking, oh God, now I'm going to get busted open. I'm scared. I mean, I'm literally I'm ready to leave the ring and go back to the dressing room. I'm so scared. My heart pounding. All of a sudden, he gets into the ring. He hits it. He was constant motion, like we were talking about earlier. He's constant motion. He hit the ropes. He comes back, drop, cock tucker, just like that. Man, he got that big pipe in his hand, so I backdropped him. He drops the damn pipe race. He said, pick it up and hit me, dumbass. I'm going, oh, me. I pick it up, and of course, he bells out of the ring, hit him, because I'm a rookie with it. But that was my introduction to Brute Bernard. It was a total rib on me, that he was going to scare me to death before he worked with me. And I ended up being a really good friend with Brute. I loved him to death.
Amazing. They were terrifying looking, those two.
Oh, yeah, he was.
It was just an incredible look of most of those guys. I guess it's because the territory's tough that the guys that would be high flyers, even later, Sabu, who was on our show, fortunately, and told us his uncle didn't want him doing any high flying, so he had to hide it from him. He just wanted him to wrestle and be the old school type guy. And Sabu, one of the great high flyers, was wanting to do all this crazy stuff, and he's hiding it. He's having to hide it from his uncle.
Yeah. One of the interesting things was the only time the Sabu and the Sheik ever wrestled each other was actually in Windsor, in one of the last shows at Windsor Arena, 1986. So that was first year or two into Sabu's career. He was, I believe it was the Sheik's opponent didn't show up, so they were kind of like, well, throw in my nephew. And that was it. After
I think he told us that story on the podcast.
Yeah. Well, the Sheik, Abdullah traveled and, became this star everywhere. The Sheik became a huge star, but didn't travel as much. Was it just because he owned the territory? Was that what it was? He had more vested interest there?
Well, probably. He was also he booked Toronto. He was Frank Tunny's matchmaker from, I believe, 69 to about 76, 77. So he was very grounded in this area. So he had like that 4-hour travel plan of having to run 2 shows, 2 territories. And I'm assuming that probably included a lot of the Toronto satellite towns like Hamilton and London and so forth. So he had a pretty busy schedule during the 70s. But yeah, that's probably what had to do with it. I mean, he was still doing he did Texas for a while there. I mean, but he didn't travel as far as he did in the 60s and early 70s, that's for sure. I mean, he also had that war against Dick the Bruiser for the Battle for Detroit in the early 70s there that probably kept him a little closer to home to make sure he was overseeing every show.
Tell us a little bit about the war that happened there in Detroit.
Well, when what became big time wrestling first started in '59 there with Barnett and Doyle, they brought all their Indiana and Chicago stars with them. So that included Dick the Bruiser. So from '59 to '64, Dick the Bruiser ran Detroit. He was the #1 star. And of course, because of the Chicago TV, that meant that Dick Bruiser was one of the top stars in the country at that time. So in '64, Barnett and Doyle left the U.S. to head to Australia to start up their own World Championship wrestling there, and they sold off all their territories, and they sold off Indiana and Chicago to Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder, and they formed WWA. And he sold off Detroit to the Sheik, who formed Big Time Wrestling. So they were both kind of the Cain and Abel, I guess, of Barnett and Doyle. And so the first 4 or 5 years, Dick and Wilbur were building WWA in Indiana and Chicago there, and Detroit Sheik's building up Big Time Wrestling. And then in the early 70s, Dick the Bruiser decided that he wanted to move back into Detroit and take over Detroit as part of WWA. And that led to these two having their weekly fights. Of one of them at Cobo Hall, which was the Sheik, and then the Bruiser took over the Olympia. So you had 2 world-class arenas, both filling up every week for 2-3 years.
Wow.
And they were having a war, and it became one of those things. If you worked for WWA, you weren't working for me, and vice versa. So you had 2 very distinct rosters. And so, I mean, ultimately the Sheik won. They stuck the loyalty, and that was, part of what I was saying earlier about there was only so many guys were willing to jump sides and work for WWA. I believe, I might get this wrong. I believe Louis Martinez was one of the ones that jumped sides, because he ended up not working for Big Time for a while there. But most of the Detroit area guys, Michigan guys, Ohio guys, all stuck with the Sheik. So at the end of the day, it just came down to loyalty, and Bruiser had to walk away nursing his wounds, but they mended fences, and Dick the Bruiser was back working Big Time Wrestling cards by the mid 70s, so it couldn't have been that bad, but it was.
No. Oh, you mentioned Dick the Bruiser there. His partner also was a Windsor guy, Crusher, right?
Crusher wasn't from Windsor, but Crusher's one of his tag team both of his tag team partners were from Windsor. Art Nielsen first. But then when he did the Lazowski brothers, Stan Lazowski was actually Stan Hollick from Windsor, which is funny because after the Lazowski brothers broke up, he became Art Nielsen's brother. So he became Stan Nielsen. So for a while there, Art Nielsen and Stan Nielsen were 2 brothers from Windsor. But Stan Lazowski, but he actually, so he was the Crusher's tag team partner for the next time after Art Nielsen moved on. Right. And so the Crusher wasn't from it, but his tag partner was. So there is a Crusher connection there.
You mentioned Don Eagle earlier. You guys were talking about Don Eagle and his father. The 1950 screw job with Gorgeous George in Chicago. Yeah. Was Don Eagle coming out of the Detroit territory for that?
No, he was probably coming. He was working the Boston. He probably would have been coming out of Montreal. Montreal and Boston were very, very tight territories with each other, with Paul Bowser down in Detroit or down in Boston, Eddie Quinn up in the Montreal area there. That was, a lot of people don't remember that or don't talk about it, but that was definitely one of the first screw jobs.
You know what's amazing about it is, and we've talked to tons of people about that screw job, whether Gorgeous George was in on it or not, obviously he didn't care, he didn't even acknowledge the title weeks later. But Gorgeous George's response was almost identical to Shawn Michaels' response in Montreal. And I mean, almost identical. You look at it and you look at the Shawn Michaels, and so you don't know. You don't know if George is you say, well, look at George's response. Well, wait a minute, look at Shawn's response. You don't know, because these guys are world-class workers So you don't know if George was in on it or not. What is your take on it? You think George was in on it?
I think he must have known something. The footage, I mean, the footage is out there. I mean, it's tough to
The
say.
referee is the one that did it. It wasn't, it wasn't George,
And Earl was a referee. His first name referee.
That's right. That's right.
Earl finally got back over in Canada at the Impact Bound for Glory there in Montreal. Earl came out and he stopped the screw job. So I think Canada's finally made peace with him after so many years. He's allowed back in Canada again.
Yeah, I still don't think Greg Oliver has made peace with Bret Hart. You mentioned Sky Low Low. I think Greg Oliver put Sky Low Low ahead of Bret Hart.
Oh, in the Canadians book.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. Maybe Greg might have rethought his ranking.
I don't know. We're just bringing it up because he wouldn't answer us on the hockey text. So
yeah,
we're just trying to stir the pot no matter what it is because we love
That's
Greg.
all right. That's all right. Stir the pot.
Exactly. Yeah, it's so interesting. The screw job with Don Eagle was, obviously Chicago, but it was such an interesting dynamic with the Dumont Network, there in Chicago that ran so much of the country. It's almost, you almost had national television at one point with the Dumont Network, and then it goes regional again. It's kind of a weird dynamic with pro wrestling that at one point it really was kind of national, then it goes territory again, then it goes back national again.
And there was multiple promotions that were almost national. I mean, Chicago was over a good chunk of the country, and so was Los Angeles Championship Wrestling from Hollywood. That was seen quite a distance as well. I mean, in a way, that was probably the WCW versus WWE battles of those days. Was which one are you going to stay up? Well, I mean, I guess they were all on separate days, but you had the regional ones as well. That, man, there was a time there in the late 40s, early to the mid 50s where I think there was about 12 different wrestling shows on TV, depending which area you lived in. It would have been an amazing time. And it's so funny reading a lot of these newspaper articles. Is I see a lot of the complaints that you still see on the internet today.
Right.
Like I was reading complaints about Gus Sonnenberg in 1929.
Wow.
Because,
exactly what you're hearing today about Gus Sonnenberg.
Exactly. And it was the grapplers from the early 1900s that were upset that Gus Sonnenberg, because he was one of the first football players to get brought in to be
dark, but sorry, yeah.
And he did the flying tackle. He did the spear, and the outrage that this guy was bringing such high flying moves into pro wrestling.
Well, you know what's BS about all this? Jim Londos, who I love, probably my favorite wrestler of all time, maybe the greatest draw of all time.
I agree 100% with you on that.
Oh, Steve Johnson's got a great book coming out about him. But one of the greatest.
John wrote the foreword to the book, right?
Oh, nice.
Very honored to have written the foreword for it. I love the book. I mean, it is a fantastic book. Jim Londos to me is such a great story. During the times of segregation and Jim Crow laws, here a Greek immigrant was the biggest star in America. Including Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey. I mean, it was unbelievable story. But he was a legit shooter. But his finish was an airplane spin.
Yeah.
One of the most hokey things there is. People go, back when wrestling was real. And there's zero real about that.
Yeah.
It's just all who does it, how you do it, but it's the same thing you're hearing today,
Absolutely. And then once they got used to Gus Sonnenberg, when Dano O'Mahony, the Irish wrestler, came in with the Irish whip. I mean, his was a bit different when he did it, that he was more closer. He would whip the guy and then pull him back and kind of clothesline him with it a bit. So it was a little bit more, but still, it was the Toronto Star sports writer Lou Marsh. I believe this was 1938, 39 when he said this. It would have been 36 or 37, but he called wrestling sports entertainment then. So whatever, because he wasn't a huge fan of this Irish whip movie. He thought it was too flashy. So he said, I guess wrestling's just sportive entertainment now.
So funny when John
say, Vince McMahon created that term. It's like, actually, they've been calling it sports entertainment since 1939.
You know what's amazing to me and Mr. Brisco is we just had John Langmead on, who wrote a great book on the history of wrestling from 1880. Ballyhoo, terrific book through about the Second World War. the business was exposed almost every week somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's not like, hey, we got to protect the business. The business was exposed
Yeah.
constantly. And
let's go to that. Your newspaper researches. I mean, you know, back in the day, that's how the results got in there. That's how people knew what was
They
going
did.
on. When did you find that those newspaper reporters started in your area started to kind of, okay, I'm not going to cover this anymore because it's not a legitimate sport?
It definitely seemed to be closer to I would say the mid '60s. It started toning down where it wasn't being as
that long.
descriptive. Yeah, because even in the '50s, I was still getting results, but it was probably the early '60s. I think maybe you were getting younger sports writers in there who were just kind of like, come on, this is hokey. This is my grandpa's stuff. This is my dad's stuff. But it went down to, it was more of a byline where it would just tell you the winners. It wasn't descriptive. And then by the early to mid '70s, they still ran the ads. They were still take the money for them, but they weren't covering them anymore, at least not to the extent they were. But the interesting thing was to see it it seemed that newspaper writers, the guys who were covering it would always be the new beat writers. It's almost like they would say to them, okay, your first assignment, you're covering wrestling this week. And you could tell if that particular guy was either a wrestling fan or wasn't, because they'd either be super enthusiastic and get really detailed, or they'd be calling them, you know, suspect pachyderms and things of, you know, you could tell that they were trying to wink and nod that I can't believe I have to cover this stupid thing. And but more often than not, they were pretty good with it. And some sports editors more than others would give it more coverage in their own daily columns. You could tell some of the guys, the further away it got from the '30s, it definitely tended to get a little less. I think because the guys in the '30s and '40s were a little bit more looking like the amateur wrestling. So these guys, it was still a good show, but apparently once the Irish whip came in, it started just ruin the reality of everything.
And the airplane spin.
And the airplane spin and everything else.
O'Mahony almost killed the business when you know, Dick Schickett, you know, double crossed him, and then they had a big lawsuit in the late '30s, and it almost killed the business because of that. You know, it's just you know, it's what happens when you bring a guy in that you want to promote, that, you know, like Wayne Munn and Stanislaus Sabisco. You bring a guy in that you can't really control the outcome of the match in the ring, and you know, it just, you got some old bastards that don't like it, and a lot of double crosses happened.
Well, I mean, there's speculation too, but the Pat O'Connor was somewhat swerved out of his own title to Buddy Rogers, because people were, I mean, I don't think he was a proper screw job, but it definitely seemed that the politics were going against him. That some of these guys, you just wonder what would have happened. I mean, if Buddy Rogers hadn't taken over, who knows what would have happened.
I just heard from a guy who was in the dressing room in 1963. I heard it through my friend Roy Lucier, you know, who's the big Lucia fan, good guy.
I've seen his name,
He just sent me and Mr. Brisco a nice note. He'd interviewed somebody who was in the dressing room in '63 that said that that match should have gone a lot longer with Sammartino. Because Sammartino, I interviewed Sammartino before he passed away, and Sammartino told me unequivocally that was a shoot, 100% shoot. He said he always turned his back and raised his hand. He said, I didn't do it. He said, I didn't want him to cheap shot me. He said, because when I got in the ring, I told him, he says, you better grab your best hold. I'm going to take the title from you. And that's when Buddy Rogers realized he didn't have a chance. And that's why the match was 48 seconds, according to Sammartino. But Roy Lucier just told me that the guy in the dressing room collaborated the story, because there's been a lot of talk whether it was really a shoot or whether it wasn't a shoot, you know, with Sammartino and Buddy Rogers.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Do you think Rogers just said, screw it, I'm just going to let him pin me right now?
Apparently there was a problem with Tootsmont and Vince McMahon Sr., and one of them, I can't remember which one it was, but one of them brought Buddy Rogers in. You know, he had said he had a heart attack, you know, before that, which he probably did. They gimmicked the commission to get him passed, but what they did was they said, we're not going to take the title off of you. One of them knew it was a double cross, one of them didn't. and Sammartino obviously knew it was. He was going to take the title off of him. That's what Bruno told me.
Wow, I didn't realize the extent of that. That's crazy.
Yeah, and so they got Buddy there under false pretense, got him out in Madison Square Garden in the ring in front of a sold out crowd, and that's when Bruno told him that, by the way, I'm taking the title off of you. And that's why Bruno, you look at a few pictures, he didn't turn his back on him. He said, I backed straight up, went over to him. The match was terrible because apparently it was a shoot. That's why it lasted
all 30 seconds of it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And took the title off of him. You know, it's just crazy. Our business is absolutely nuts. It's just
it's fantastic. Well, David, tell us a little bit what's going on with this Maple Leaf Pro, which John and I both follow a website on Facebook, Maple Leaf Wrestling. It's a tremendous website. That's how we got in contact with you. It's great. If you want to know wrestling history from that area, man, I had a friend and I like that Facebook page. It's a wonderful Facebook page if you like history of wrestling there. But it's kind of a revival going on with Maple Leaf Pro, isn't there?
It is, and it's Windsor's own Scott D'Amore is spearheading that, who's run Border City Wrestling here in Windsor for 31 years now, and of course best known to a lot of people as being behind the scenes with TNA Wrestling for the past 7 or 8 years up until this early this year, and he also had a big run behind the scenes with TNA back in the first decade of it. And he's got some of the got the archival rights for Maple Leaf Wrestling, and as you mentioned, some of the old matches are starting to go up on the Facebook page and the YouTube channel. And October 19th and 20th, the revival returns to Windsor, so it's pretty cool. It's going to start in Windsor, and hopefully they're looking to get it back to Toronto to Maple Leaf Gardens, because there's still an ice rink in that building, so they want to bring it back and have the full revival there.
That's awesome. I love being on the Facebook page, but I just every day there's something different on it. You know, there's great history, great pictures. Whoever runs it does an incredible job with it. And
that's Terry Harris. He's phenomenal. He does a phenomenal job with that page.
And for those of you that are listening, it's on Facebook. It's what is it? Maple Leaf Gardens is
Maple Leaf.
Anyway, you do that, you'll find
Maple Leaf Wrestling. Yeah,
Maple Leaf Garden Wrestling.
And Jamie, what are you doing now? You got the book out. What are you doing now?
Well, I'm doing some promo stuff. I've been doing some signings and book launches. It's available on Amazon in almost every country in the world, so it's available everywhere if you're interested. And it's kind of sparked me to keep digging. So I'm actually in the preliminary research work right now. My next book is going to be on the history of Maple Leaf Wrestling. So I'm going to be doing the Toronto territory. So
I love that territory. It's so interesting to me. There's so much ethnic diversity coming out of that territory, and it's so you had Wilbur Billy Watson, but you didn't. There wasn't a creation organically of a lot of stars, but you had great stars that came there and became stars. One of
the things I've just uncovered, I've just been working on right now with the Toronto territory. And speaking of Bruno Sammartino, Toronto was where he bet on himself to prove to Vince Sr. that he could be a star.
100%.
Because he wasn't being booked all that well, and he thought he could be a main eventer, and Vince said, "Nah, we don't think you're quite there." So he said, "Screw it." And he quit Capital Sports and went up to Toronto because he did his research and noticed that apparently outside of Italy, Toronto is the 4th largest Italian population in the world.
Wow.
Behind only New York City, and the other 2 cities were in South America, oddly enough. So outside of New York City, so he decided, I'm going to go there. And he contacted every Italian newspaper, because he realized that with that large of a population, there's got to be Italian newspapers, Italian radio, Italian television. Contacted them all, sent them press kits in Italian, called them in Italian.
All this was self promotion.
All self done.
Wow!
And within 2 weeks, he was one of the biggest stars in Toronto, and suddenly the entire population, and it helped kickstart Maple Leaf Wrestling. They were on a bit of a decline. Suddenly there was 10,000 people showing up to see Bruno in Toronto, and he did that for a year. And he sent all the press clippings back to Vince Sr. and said, "Look what I could do! Look what I did to the Italian population in Toronto in 8 months."
Well, you
And
know,
Vince said, "Well, let's try that in New York, and we'll see how it works." And
well, you know, one of the reasons he had to go to Toronto was apparently he was booked at a town he didn't know he was booked.
yes,
You know, that's
yeah,
how old promoters would, get guys blackballed, and they'd
he was
come in
suspended.
town and he didn't know he was booked, and he didn't show up. Then he gets banned by the commission, so he can't work
By
there.
the commission. And all those commissions in the Northeast, they were tight. They all worked together too, so he couldn't get booked anywhere in the state
So
in
he
the
said,
You
"Fine,
could
Northeast.
say
gonna
tight, or you could
you're gonna
say
suspend
corrupt.
me. I'm gonna go find something else."
Yeah, corrupt.
Yeah. And also, he had the story of Bruno in Toronto was just fascinating to me. You know, he also did all that strongman stuff. He wrestled that orangutan. I mean, he did some crazy things up there. And he might have been the world's strongest man at the time, but he did all that strongman stuff for the Italian population. Everybody covered it, and all of a sudden, oh my God, look at this guy! He's a monster.
There's an annual picnic in Toronto, the Chin family picnic. Chin's is the Italian TV station there, and Tony Parisi ran wrestling shows there all the way through to the 80s, and Bruno would be there every year, sort of the guest of honor for this picnic festival. And I have a buddy of mine, Ronaldo Augustino. He's the city councilor here in Windsor. And he was telling me that his mom, and because he grew up in Toronto, they would go to these picnics every year. And he said he swears that if you were to rank the most important people in his mom's life, it was Jesus Christ #1, but Bruno was #2, ahead of the Bruno. It's crazy to even. It's hard to imagine how big Bruno was to Italian immigrants. That it's almost incomprehensible unless you were one, and that was just really cool.
When I interviewed him, a year or two before he passed away, he was telling me about it, hiding from the Nazis in the Abruzzi Hills, which also Rocky Marciano was from, and his mother going down and, getting captured one time, and he's coming back. He's telling me these incredible stories about coming to America, almost dying, and had to wait a while because he was so sick. And we took a little break for a second. He goes, are my answers okay?
Wow.
Like, you're freaking Bruno Sammartino. You can read the phone book back to me.
You can nod your head though, Bill.
I'm just sitting there listening, going, I cannot believe I'm in the same room with Bruno Sammartino listening to these. It was just one of the greatest moments of my life was getting to sit down with him for a couple hours and him just telling me his life story. It was I kept
John, before we get off of Jamie here, something that's familiar with you that I don't want to lose sight of that we mentioned and we kind of just passed over very quickly. John wrestled a bear back in his young days and basically almost got kicked off a football scholarship at Abilene Christian University there. You mentioned a bear man there. How do you know anything about the bear man and how that developed? I mean, that's a great part of our history that don't get talked about a lot.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know as much about it as our friend Wes Maidman does. He runs a Wildman fan page, but he was very much sort of the Ontario promoter that took care of all the towns in the late 60s to the late 80s until he passed away. He booked all the towns that the Tunnys wouldn't touch in Ontario. So he by de facto, he was Windsor's wrestling promoter for a good decade. Wow. So he ccame through a lot. And it's Gene Dubois originally there with his wrestling bear, Terrible Ted. And the Wildman Promotions. During the early days, he aligned up with WWA, so he had a lot of bruisers guys working for him. Actually, Bobby Heenan wrestled at the high school near my house in '72. When he was with Blackjack Mulligan at the time. Back when he was still Pretty Boy, Bobby Heenan. So it's been really cool to go through that. And then, of course, by about '73, after the War of Detroit, he sided with the Sheik, and he got more of the Sheik's guys. So the Sheik was on it all the time. So all the shows over here were done with the Sheiks, but he brought Andre the Giant here in '74 for several runs throughout the '70s, and so he brought a lot of the guys through. So it was really cool.
Well, Jamie, I thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
It's been fascinating talking to you about all this history. I going through your book. It's just I love what you've done and the research to it and all the great names. it's just incredible to read that history and especially the way you put it together so well in your book. It's really well done.
Thank you very much. I really hope that it inspires other people who live in other towns that aren't, maybe it might not necessarily be one of the big markets, because there's got to be a lot more smaller towns like Windsor. I mean, Windsor's about 250,000, 300,000 people with our area. Obviously growing up right, 5 minutes outside of Detroit's not something everyone's got. But there's a lot of history in a lot of these small towns, and we're hitting that point where we're going to lose a lot of that history forever, because a lot of the guys that remember it are getting up there. And I think it's important to get it written down, whether it's online or in a book, to get this history out there so that we don't lose it.
Well, we're hoping to help too with these podcasts we've been doing. John and I are both history nuts, as you can tell. I mean, from the guests that we've had on. We really enjoy talking about the history of our business. It's a strange, wonderful business. But speaking of small promotions, small town, the town next to you guys, Winnipeg, that's a little bit further west here. That's another kind of like a Windsor town.
Absolutely.
Promotion.
Yeah.
Who do you know that would probably be a good expert on
that? Winnipeg.
Yes, sir.
Chris Jericho would be a good. Chris Jericho, Kenny Omega, Don Callis, they're all from Winnipeg. It's got a pretty rich history, and not to mention all this.
It's got a great history.
It was part of the AWA territory as well.
Right, so, exactly.
Got a lot, and it's because Canada's so big that we don't have these expensive territories or as many territories. It was pretty much, Tunny had Ontario. The Rougeaus had Quebec. Emile Dupree had the Maritimes with Atlantic Grand Prix. And then you had AWA had Winnipeg, Manitoba, but Winnipeg was really the only stop.
Then you forget about Vancouver too. I mean,
Vancouver, yeah. Then you've got the Western Canada, you've got All Star Wrestling in Vancouver, Kiniski's promotion, and then you've got Stu Hart in Alberta there with Stampede. And Stampede covered Saskatchewan. And Manitoba was kind of the odd man out. It was that buffer territory between the eastern and western provinces. Right. Yeah. But it was a big, huge stomping ground of the AWA.
In your research, like here in the U.S., I mean, we made territories. Were there a group of guys that went, like, say, from the Maritimes and just worked their way across Canada? Was that
not
a
really
thing?
Promoter. That's one of the things that Maple Leaf Pro is looking to do, is to become the first national Canadian promotion, because Canada's never had its own national promotion.
That's right. That has always amazed me. I think because of the geography, maybe, things are.
The problem is with Canada is that most of our population is across the border. We're all so close to the U.S. border that there's so much expensive land between cities that it's really hard to tour across Canada and at least do it cheaply. So people do short runs. They'll fly out to Vancouver and they might do a run to Calgary and back or something. Or you can do Detroit to Montreal, or you can do the Maritimes. It's tough to do a cross Canada tour the way you could tour around the U.S. because there's not a lot of stops in between. So we'll see what happens.
One of the great photos of wrestling kind of history was we're coming back from Winnipeg and we're going to, I think, Minneapolis, and the pilot tells us, ladies and gentlemen, we just started bombing Afghanistan, and so we had a Obama-Osama party. So all the guys are sitting there having beers, and because at that point the patriotic fervor, was we want to get these guys back, and so we said, hey, let's take a picture to remember this day that when we invaded Afghanistan, and all the guys are on the plane, a charter WWE plane, and Kurt Angle goes, wait a minute, guys, you're going to kill my gimmick. Let's all drink milk. So we found milk cartons, and there's this picture of all of us, Stone Cold, Kurt Angle, Edge, and all the guys are all holding up milk cartons. We're all bombed. Nice. But it says it was the Obama-Osama party coming back from Winnipeg to Minneapolis.
You could put vodka in milk. It's still good.
That's right. I don't think any of the milk got drank, but we did.
Fair enough.
Hey, Jamie. Hey, thanks so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.